Great. So, as I said, welcome to the Eastside Freedom Library and our special event this evening with scholar activist Chris Mato Nunpa and his book, The Great Evil. The Eastside Freedom Library is now 7.5 years old. For the last year and a half, we've been doing most of our programming online. I hope you will join us for future events. I just want to mention that this Saturday afternoon, there will be a panel discussion about issues of nuclear power and nuclear weapons in Japan with a panel of Japanese scholar activists. That's this Saturday at 1. And something else that we've been doing during the pandemic, and particularly this last summer, is holding events on our front lawn. And I want to mention that on Saturday, October 23rd, we will hear from Danny Klecko, the poet, with his new book of poetry, Lincoln Land. And we will have music from the gated community led by Sumanth Gopinath from the University of Minnesota. So join us on the lawn, join us online. We are open during the day if people want to come in and use books and do research. We do ask that you make an appointment so that we can limit the number of people in the space and that you commit to wearing a mask and maintaining social distances. So this evening's program features, I'm very proud to say, my old friend, Chris Mato Nunpa. Chris is, on the one hand, retired from being an academic professor. On the other hand, he's just published a book and is working on 2 additional books. So he has a lot to share with us. Tonight's topic is his book, The Great Evil. Chris taught in the study of Indigenous Nations and Dakota studies at Southwest Minnesota State University. He holds a PhD in higher education administration from the University of Minnesota with a collateral field for the PhD in American Indian Studies. This book, which you're about to learn about tonight, The Great Evil, is, I think, a very important and remarkable book in that it doesn't just fill the holes in the history of Dakota people that many of us might not know, but it works from a Dakota perspective to offer us the opportunity to look at us being white people, for us to look at our own history in new and critical ways. And here we are in the week before Indigenous Peoples Day to have the opportunity to learn from Dr. Mato Nunpa. So we will have a question and answer session after Chris's presentation. We will ask you to use the chat function here on Zoom or the comment function on the Facebook page. And then we will move into yet another stage of conversation where we will invite everyone to unmute and reveal yourselves and have a little bit of casual conversation and build some community. So while you are currently invisible and muted, you will have your opportunity to participate in the conversation. And I am now going to mute myself and render myself invisible and turn things over to Chris Mato Nunpa. Thank you all for joining us this evening.
Well, thank you, Peter. And Peter mentioned that I'm an old friend, and he's got that right. I'm 81 winters old now, so I'm truly old. Mitakuyapi, once ichante washtea, napechiu sapido. Damakota, naku churchemitawa ki he Mato Nunpa. This is a greeting in the language of the first Minnesotans, the Dakota people. It says, "Hello, my relatives, with a good heart. I greet all of you with a handshake." Then I just said that my name is Mato Nunpa, or Two Bear, Two Bear. And then I said that I am a Dakota, Damakota. So I just say that as words of introduction and some brief information. Genocide, the Bible, and atrocities, killing women, children, babies, and elders. And here is a quote that I wanted to include: "Razing, R-A-Z, and destroying enemy villages and fields, killing women and children, raiding settlements for captives, intimidating and brutalizing non-combatants, and assassinating enemy leaders in the frontier wars between 1607 and 1814, white Americans forged two elements, unlimited war and irregular war, into their first way of war." A quotation by John Grenier in his article, "The First Way of War," in 2005. When I wrote my book, The Great Evil, it was based on my three research interests: Indigenous Nation studies, and genocide studies, and biblical studies. Also, as I studied, read, and took courses for both my master's degree, 1971, and my PhD, 1974, at the University of Minnesota, Twin Cities campus, I learned about the violence, the land theft, the broken treaties, the genocide, etc. In the hundreds of genocidal massacres which occurred to our First Nations people in the first 4 centuries the white man was here, I read about the Bible verses and the biblical allusions that were made and quoted by the white killers as they slaughtered our women, children, babies, and elders, along with the men. I thought to myself, geez, I need to write about this and let the world know, and future generations of Dakota/Indigenous children know what was done to our Indigenous peoples and who did it. And I tried to interweave my knowledge from my 3 research interests in the narrative of what I considered the great evil that was perpetrated by the US government and its US Euro-American citizenry and the Euro-Minnesotan citizenry. And so I present the Bible verses which were used to justify, number 1, murdering Native peoples, anywhere from 16 to 18 million Indigenous peoples slaughtered in 4 centuries. Number 2, stealing all of our lands, which numbers about 3 billion acres. And number 3, criminalizing and suppressing our religious ceremonies and spirituality, contrary to the white man's sacred document, the US Constitution, the First Amendment. And number 4, enslaving our Indigenous peoples. I will focus on particular atrocities which involve the murdering of women, children, babies, and elders, along with the Bible verses in which Yahweh, the Old Testament God, commanded these atrocious murders that were perpetrated by the Israelites in the Old Testament. These are subjects which are not taught in any of the white schools, universities, and colleges, both public and private, because they are so damning to the US government and its white citizenry and would not encourage US nationalism and patriotism. As David Bolin writes, the best interests of the white American philosophy of education would not be served if 3rd graders were taught that during the 19th century, the American farmer was perhaps the most ruthless and relentless exterminator of the Indians, or that, again, white American frontiersmen, cowboys, and soldiers often excelled in the use of barbaric torture, brutality, and slaughter in their encounters with Indians. Dave Bolin in his North America, The Blind Spot in History, written in November of 1969. Some background statements. However, before I go into the book, Bible verses and atrocities, I would like to make some background statements. First, perspective. Since I am an Indigenous person and a Dakota man, I do not come from a Western European or a US Euro-American or a Euro-Minnesotan point of view. I come from a Dakota perspective specifically, and from an Indigenous perspective generally. Example, where the white man say, we settle the land. We, the Dakota and other Indigenous peoples might say, no, no, the white man stole the lands. Furthermore, he didn't pay for the land either, in general. Number two, I dislike and generally do not use the following terms except if the terms are used in sentences which I am quoting. For example, A, Indian, a colonial imposition. The term Indian obscures the richness and diversity of Indigenous cultures and societies. Besides, we as First Nations peoples are not from India. B, the word tribe. Instead, I say people or nation. Nations and peoples make treaties, not tribes. My Dakota people made about a dozen treaties with the US and other foreign entities. C, the term Sioux. We are not an enemy or a snake. Dakota means friend or ally. D, I do not use the term Native American because it is inaccurate. I used to ask students in my course when I was teacher, how many here were born in the United States? Invariably, most of the students, with the exception for students from other countries, would raise their hands. And then I would say, congratulations, you all are Native Americans. To me, anyone born here in Indigenous homelands are Native Americans. And in the book, the publisher, I don't like the term Native American, but he used it. Christianity, the Bible, and the Native American genocide. But he's the publisher. And E, also, I do not generally use the term American, nor do I identify as an American because of what the white Americans did to our native peoples, killing us by the millions, stealing all of our indigenous homelands, breaking all of our treaties, et cetera, et cetera. And F, I use Indigenous or Native or First Nations or Aboriginal to refer to the peoples who were here when the invaders, the killers, the destroyers, and exploiters came to Indigenous homelands in the Indigenous hemisphere in 1492. 3, on page 2 of The Great Evil is a sentence which reads, quote, as with the Genocide Project, it was a time of mass killing. The killing fields were the entire expanse of what is now known as the United States of America. About 98.5% of the 16 million indigenous peoples of the US at the time of contact, 1500, had been systematically killed off. By 1900, there were only 237,000 plus or so Aboriginal peoples left, according to the US Bureau of Census. This is an extermination rate of 98.5%, according to the US Bureau of Census. This is an extermination rate of 98.5%, an incredible killing efficiency, killing efficiency, which Hitler admired about the United States. Dr. Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz writes in her book, North America is a crime scene. North America is a crime scene. Another writer, Jody Bird, says, the story of the New World is horror. The story of America, a crime. Dunbar Ortiz further says, quote, it is necessary, Bird argues, to start with the origin of the United States as a settler state and its explicit intention to occupy the continent. These origins contain the historical seeds of genocide, and any true history of the United States must focus on what has happened to and with Indigenous peoples and what still happens. An Indigenous Peoples History of the United States, written by Dr. Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz in 2014. Atrocities, Ray, the killing of women, children, babies, and elders. Now, on to what I really want to discuss this evening. That is, I wish to present what was done to our Indigenous peoples of what is now known as the United States of America and who did it. We already know that it was the United States government and its military and its Euro-American citizenry, farmers, settlers, cowboys, frontiersmen, and others who perpetrated genocide and all the atrocities which accompanied the murder and extermination of First Nations people. For example, Columbus, in first grade at the Granite Falls Public Schools in Granite Falls, Minnesota in 1947, when I entered first grade, I learned about Columbus, I think for the first time, because I don't remember my folks ever talking about Columbus. I learned the poem, which includes the line, in 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. I remembered the white female teacher saying that Columbus was a hero because he discovered America, and that he was a good man because he was a Christian. In my college years and in my graduate studies for the master and the PhD, I learned that what the teachers at the Granite Falls Elementary School and at the junior high school and at the senior high school were not only inaccurate, but also they were outright lies. Here are three atrocities out of many which Columbus and his soldiers committed against the First Nations people. Number one, burning Native people alive at the stake. On page 62 of my book, we see Hatui being burned alive at the stake. Columbus and his soldiers found Hatui and his people and killed most of them, and the remainder were enslaved. And then they condemned their leader to be burned alive. Dr. David Stannard chronicles the event. Quote, reportedly, as they were tying him, that is Hatui, to the stake, a Franciscan friar urged him to take Jesus to his heart so that his soul might go to heaven. Rather than descend into hell, Hatui replied that if heaven was where the Christians went, he would rather go to hell. This was a common practice, that is, burning Native peoples alive at the stake. And by the common practice of the Roman Catholic Church and its zealous adherents. And Columbus and his men, they were no exception. Number two, hanging 13 natives at a time. On page 61, quote, the Spaniards found pleasure in inventing all kinds of odd cruelties. The more cruel, the better. They built a long gibbet low enough for the toes to touch the ground and prevent strangling, and hang 13 natives at a time in honor of Christ our Savior and the 12 apostles. How do Christians, who are supposed to have the love of God and Jesus in their hearts and to show mercy and to forgive, and yet at the same time perpetrate genocide and all manner of torture and cruelty. Apparently, they're not aware of their cognitive dissonance. Number three, David E. Standard, mentioned above in his American Holocaust, writes that Columbus and his soldiers used, quote, ferocious armored dogs that had been trained to kill and disembowel the native peoples, forcing them to supply food and women and slaves. They killed indiscriminately natives they encountered. The troops would steal, kill, rape, and torture the indigenous peoples. The natives had their hands cut off if they didn't bring in their 3-month quota of gold. Quote, they would test their swords and their manly strength on captured First Nations peoples and place bets on the slicing off of heads or the cutting of bodies in half with one blow. They burned or hanged captured chiefs. They tore babies from their mother's breast and dashed their heads against the rocks. This incident reminds me of a Bible verse, Psalms 137, verses 1, 8, and 9. Quote, by the rivers of Babylon, there we sat and wept as we thought of Zion. Fair Babylon, you predator, a blessing on him who repays you in kind what you have inflicted on us. A blessing on him who seizes your babies and dashes them against the rocks. This is from the Jewish Bible, Tanakh, the Holy Scriptures published by the Jewish Publication Society in Philadelphia. This genocidal sentiment from the Bible is what Dr. Philip Jenkins would characterize as, quote, a text of terror. And this is in his laying down the sword, why we can't ignore the Bible's violent verses written in 2011. Another thing Jenkins says is biblical violence is often marked by indiscriminate savagery, unquote. Also, Jenkins had a section in his book titled The Most Disturbing Conquest Texts, but I would call it the most disturbing genocidal texts, unquote. Back to Columbus. To test the sharpness of their blades, they began to rip open the bellies, to cut and kill men, women, children, and old folk, all of whom were seated off guard and frightened. Not a man of all of them remained alive, unquote. In the hundreds of genocidal massacres perpetrated against the indigenous peoples on the mainland in the first 4 centuries, beginning with 1492, the indiscriminate killing of women, children, babies, elders was routine. One oral history tells of white soldiers taking Dakota babies and dashing their heads against a tree or a rock and throwing their bodies into the water back in 1862 with the Dakota U.S. War and the aftermath, especially on the forced march of 1,700 of our women, children, babies, and elders on November 7th through the 13th, 1862, and when they were imprisoned at the Fort Snelling concentration camp for 6 months in a cold Minnesota winter from November 1862 through April 1863. Hundreds died of cold, exposure, hunger, disease, or murder during this bitterly cold Minnesota winter of 1862-63. I had a grandmother who was in the forced march, mentioned in the preceding paragraph, who was stabbed in the stomach by a soldier on horseback and killed. What did she do? Her sin was not understanding a command in a foreign language, English, the order to move on. Then her body was thrown in the water. We have no body or no idea where her body is. Thus, we have no closure. And we, the family and relatives, carry this historical trauma with us to this day in the year 2021, an incident which happened 159 years ago in November 1862. Hopefully, the listener is getting an idea of the cruelty, barbarism, and savagery of Columbus supposedly a Christian, a good Roman Catholic, and his soldiers in their genocidal and evil treatment of the native peoples of the Caribbean. In 21 years, 8 million First Nations peoples were slaughtered by Columbus and his men. The native peoples had been, quote, killed by violence, disease, and despair, so says Stannard. To provide a perspective, this figure of 8 million people killed in 21 is 2 million more than the 6 billion killed by Hitler and the Nazis in the Jewish Shoah. Eventually, anywhere from 16 to 18 million indigenous peoples were victims of genocide on the mainland, perpetrated by the US government and its Western European and US Euro-American citizenry. This caused Stannard to write the following: the destruction of the Indians was far and away the most massive act of genocide in the history of the world. This is worth repeating. The destruction of the Indians of the Americas was far and away the most massive act of genocide in the history of the world. So please, listeners, when the word is genocide is mentioned, please think about the genocide of the native peoples of the Americas. The Pequot Holocaust. On May 26, 1637, the Christian English made a stealthy night attack on a stockaded Pequot town on the Mystic River in Connecticut. The whites attacked the town, setting fire to it, slaying men, women, and children as they fled the flames, and slaughtered its 700 plus inhabitants. Dr. Ward Churchill writes that the number of Pequots fried in the fire or bayoneted by good Christian killers was closer to 900. This figure would include women, children, babies, and elders, along with the men. The killers regarded this mass killing of the Pequots by fire as a sacrifice to God, similar to the Old Testament killing a lamb or ram by fire as a sweet-smelling sacrifice to God for the people's sin. There is a number of such Bible verses regarding the killing of sheep or a lamb as a sacrifice to Yahweh, the Old Testament Jewish God, which were quoted during the time of the murdering. For example, out of many examples, Leviticus 8:21 reads, and, quote, and Moses burnt the whole ram upon the altar. It was a burnt sacrifice for a sweet savor and an offering made by fire unto the Lord, as the Lord commanded Moses. The Torah, the 5 books of Moses, 1962, 1967, quote, Moses turned all of the ram into smoke on the altar. That was a burnt offering for a pleasing odor and offering by fire to the Lord. The meaning of this verse in both versions is very clear. The burning of the ram was an act of worship to Yahweh or to God. It is also apparent that the Christian English considered, quote, in a similar grisly way, the burning by fire of the Pequot people was literally, quote, a sweet sacrifice and produced a sweet and pleasing odor unto the Lord. Listen to the statement of William Bradford as he described the conflagration which burned hundreds upon hundreds of Pequots in the fire. Quote, it was a fearful sight to see them frying in the fire, and the streams of blood, quenching the same. And horrible was the stink and scent thereof, but the victory seemed a sweet sacrifice, and they gave praise thereof to God, who had wrought so wonderfully for them, thus to enclose their enemies in their hand and give them so speedy a victory over so proud and insulting an enemy. William Bradford, a descendant of the historical William Bradford, is today a champion of Indigenous peoples, perhaps atoning for his ancestors' cruel and genocidal attitude, question mark. Note Bradford's phrase, to see them frying in the fire. This is a reference to the women, children, babies, and elders who were consumed in the flames. Many of the men were out hunting for food. The streams of blood refer to the blood of the native peoples who were non-combatants, who were innocents. Also note the pious English Christians giving, quote, praise thereof to God who had wrought so wonderfully for them, unquote. This particular phrase is found in 1 Samuel chapter 6, verse 6. In both instances, God was helping the Israelites kill the Canaanites and the other indigenous peoples of Canaan. And then now he was now helping the symbolic Israelites, that is, the Christian, English Christian soldiers who were marching off to war against the Pequots and slaughtering the women, children, babies, and elders. In regard to the killing of native peoples, and especially the innocents, listen to the quotation of John Underhill, a partner in crime with John Mason, who reassured his fellow killers that, quote, sometimes the scripture declareth women and children must perish with their parents, and that just because the women and children are vulnerable, weak, helpless, and unarmed, quote, did not make their deaths any less a delight to the Puritans' God. Here are a few verses out of many which illustrate the killing of women and children. I'm just going to mention them. Deuteronomy chapter 2, verses 33, 34, Joshua 10, 28, referring to Makkedah, a victim city in which they were utterly destroyed, and all the souls that were therein. And 3, Joshua 10:30 refers to another victim city, Libnah, and he smote it with the edge of the sword, and all the souls that were therein, he let none escape. And 4, Deuteronomy chapter 7, verses 2 and 16. Here is a verse which was directly quoted in the fire of nearly 900 Pequots. Quote, and when the Lord your God delivers them over to you, ye shall conquer them and utterly destroy them. You shall make no covenant with them, nor show mercy to them. That's the New King James Version. And then also you shall destroy all the peoples whom the Lord your God delivers over to you. Your eye shall have no pity on them. This is God who is speaking and commanding. Number 5, Deuteronomy 20, verses 16 through 17. And again, these verses were used directly in the Pequot Holocaust. You shall leave nothing that breathes remain alive, but you shall utterly destroy them, the Hittite and the Amorite, etc., just as the Lord your God has commanded you. This is another verse which Standard says is directly connected to the Pequot Holocaust. One of the most damning scriptures in this writer's perspective is found in 1 Samuel chapter 15, verses 3, which reads, quote, now go and attack Amalek and utterly destroy all that they have, and do not spare them, but kill both man and woman, infant and nursing child. Infant and nursing child. Here we see Yahweh, the Jewish God of the Old Testament, commanding the Israelites to kill not just the men, but also to kill the infants, that is, the babies and the nursing child. I ask you, listeners who are out there listening, quote, what kind of God commands the killing of children, toddlers, babies who are still nursing? The answer, a genocidal killer God does. The Wounded Knee Massacre. The Wounded Knee Massacre occurred on December 29th, 1890 in western South Dakota, where the Pine Ridge Reservation is located. Dr. Russell Thornton, in his book, characterizes this atrocity as perhaps the best known genocide of the North American Indians in his American Indian Holocaust and Survival, 1987. There, the U.S. 7th Cavalry slaughtered anywhere from 350 to 375 Lakota people, human beings, men, women, children, babies, and elders, and were then left in the brutal South Dakota winter snows. Quote, the massacre was reminiscent of the Old Testament mass killings ordered by Yahweh, the cruel, angry, vindictive killer God of the Old Testament. Quote, to kill all that breatheth, to utterly exterminate, and to leave no survivors. Ward Churchill, in his Little Matter of Genocide, 1997, quotes Ralph Andrus' long death. Quote, all witnesses agree from the moment it opened fire, the soldiers ceased to be a military unit and became a mass of infuriated men intent on butchery. Women and children attempted to escape by running up a dry ravine, but were pursued and slaughtered. There is no other word by hundreds of maddened soldiers. The line of bodies afterward was found to extend more than 2 miles from the camp, and they were all women and children. A few survivors eventually found shelter in brushy gullies here and there, and their pursuers had scouts call out their names, and that women and children would come out of hiding because there was nothing to fear. So some small boys crept out and were surrounded by soldiers who then butchered them. Nothing Indian that lived was safe, unquote. Note the statement, and they were all women and children. This harkens back to the Pequot Holocaust some 253 years before in 1637. Then again, John Underhill said, quote, sometimes the scripture declareth women and children must perish with their parents. These Christian English and other subsequent Christian soldiers knew well their Bible and used God's commands as a basis to justify their killing and slaughter and torture. Black Elk describes the scene thusly, quote, dead and wounded women and children and little babies were scattered all along there where they had been trying to run away. Black Elk saw people who had been, quote, torn to pieces where the wagon guns, that in parentheses, Hotchkiss machine guns, parentheses, hit them. I saw a little baby trying to suck its mother, but she was bloody and dead, unquote. Black Elk goes on to say, I saw many dead Lakota. I wished that I had died too, but I was not sorry for the women and children. It was better for them to be happy in the other world, and I wanted to be there too. Some descriptions are so heartrending and all are almost too much to bear. Again, I wish to remind the listeners that it is important to remember that the Old Testament God commanded the mass killing of innocents, women, children, babies, and elders, the most vulnerable groups in any society. For example, Deuteronomy 2:33-34 says, quote, and the Lord our God delivered him Sion over to us, and we utterly destroyed the men, women, and little ones. There was a racist, white supremacist, and a racial hating guy, an editor, who urged the extermination of all US native peoples. This guy wrote, quote, the nobility of the redskin is extinguished, and what few are left are a pack of whining curs who lick the hand that smites them. The whites, by law of conquest, by justice of civilization, are masters of the American continent, and the best safety of the frontier settlements will be secured by the total annihilation of the few remaining Indians. Why not annihilation? Their glory has fled, their spirit broken, their manhood effaced. Better that they should die than live the miserable wretches they are, unquote. As if that was not enough, this guy once more lifted up his figurative sword 4 days later and did mightily smite us. He wrote, quote, "We had better, in order to protect our civilization, follow it up and wipe these untamed and untamable creatures from the face of the earth," unquote. This man was just like the Old Testament God who called for, quote, "utter extermination of the indigenous peoples of Canaan." The guy's name was L. Frank Baum, who was editor of the Aberdeen, South Dakota Saturday Pioneer, and was also the author of The Wonderful Wizard of Oz and other children's books. Baum would fit right in with Yahweh's mass murdering barbarians, the Israelites, and fit in well with Columbus, with George Washington, with Thomas Jefferson, with Andrew Jackson, with the Reverend Colonel John Chivington, with Abraham Lincoln, with Theodore Roosevelt, with Donald Trump, and with other racists, white supremacists, racial haters, Republicans, and neo-Nazis. The Sand Creek Massacre. The Sand Creek Massacre occurred on November 29, 1864 in Colorado. The U.S. Army, along with civilian Coloradans, did not spare them. That is the Cheyenne and Arapaho people, put to death men and women and children and infants. The commander of the killer troops was Colonel John Chivington, who also was a Methodist minister. An incidental comment, reportedly, Chivington, a 6'4", 260-pound man, when he would preach, would place his two pistols on either side of the Bible on the lectern of the Denver Methodist Church and, quote, "then proceed to dispense with either hot hell or hot lead," unquote. The Reverend Colonel Chivington and his troops butchered approximately 500 Cheyenne and Arapaho, mostly old men, women, children, infants, and toddlers. I suspect that Reverend Chivington and his men regarded the native peoples of the indigenous hemisphere, the Cheyenne and Arapaho in this case, as uncivilized, pagans, infidels, barbarians, savages, and who needed to come out of their heathen darkness unto the marvelous light of the gospel of Jesus Christ. Furthermore, they would actually believe they were not murdering or killing, but doing good in getting rid of such miserable wretches by perpetrating the butchery of such wicked people, and that they need not feel any remorse or twinge of conscience. They could feel righteous because they were followers of God and were merely fulfilling the word of the Lord. Now on to some of the individual incidents of cruelty and barbarity in the genocidal massacre at Sand Creek in Colorado. One white soldier, John Smith, an interpreter, later testified at a trial. They were scalped, their brains knocked out. The white men used their knives, ripped open women, clubbed little children, knocked them in the head with their guns, beat their brains out, mutilated their bodies in every sense of the word, worse mutilated than any I ever saw before. Children, 2 or 3 months old, all lying there from sucking infants to warriors. The orders, and another quote, the orders by Colonel Chivington were simple. There were to be no prisoners. This is from Mendoza's book, Song of Sorrow. Robert Bent writes, all the squaws in that hole were afterwards killed and 4 or 5 bucks inside. The squaws offered no resistance. Everyone I saw dead was scalped. I saw one squaw cut open with an unborn child lying by her side. Captain Soule afterwards told me that such was the case. I saw quite a number of infants in arms killed with their mothers, just like it says in 1 Samuel 15:3, but kill both man and woman, infant and nursing child. New King James Version. George Bent, a mixed race, Cheyenne and White writes, quote, what he and his Cheyenne companions witnessed on their run from the massacre was horrible. Old men, women, and children, quote, lying thickly scattered on the sand, some dead and the rest too badly wounded to move. Song of Sorrow by Patrick M. Mendoza. David Stannard recounts an incident involving a small boy. Quote, then as one of the cavalrymen later told it, while his compatriots were slaughtering and mutilating the bodies of all the women and all the children they could catch, he spotted the boy trying to flee. There was one little child, probably 3 years old, just big enough to walk through the sand. The Indians had gone ahead and this little child was behind, following after them, trying to catch up. The little boy was perfectly naked, traveling on the sand. I saw one man get off his horse at a distance of about 75 yards and draw up his rifle and fire. He missed the child. Another man came up and said, let me try the son of a bitch. I can hit him. He got down off his horse, kneeled down and fired at the little child, but he missed him. A third man came up and made a similar remark and fired, and the little fellow dropped. This is an horrific example of human cruelty and savagery. Another quote, when the morning first exploded into gunfire, White Antelope emerged from his lodge with his arms raised and shouted in English, stop, stop. But the carnage continued. When he realized it was hopeless, he stood tall and folded his arms and began to sing the Cheyenne death song, as so many of our peoples, native peoples on the plains in particular, do have death songs. Although unarmed and 75 years old, White Antelope was shot down and killed, unquote. A white soldier dismounted from his horse and took out his knife. He then scalped the old chief. He also cut off White Antelope's nose, just like the racist and white supremacist Andrew Jackson would do. He would cut off the noses of the Muskogee men he had killed. And this soldier cut, along with the nose of White Antelope, cut the ears and private parts and bragged that he was going to make a new tobacco pouch from the freshly severed genitalia. I wrote this part about the Sand Creek in 1975, as it is, took a long time to write this. A lot of procrastination too. After I had written about the Pequot Holocaust and the Wounded Knee Massacre, and I was profoundly affected by all this killing of our indigenous peoples and by all the violence, brutality, and savagery of the white soldiers, I was overwhelmed with feelings of anger, sorrow, and grief. Then when I read that White Antelope was 75 years old, and I realized that I was 75 winters old, I broke down and wept. Later on in the day, back in 1975, I resumed my writing. It was an emotional experience to write this book. I might add here that was anger, sorrow, overwhelming grief, resentment, hatred, bitterness, and a desire for vengeance. And as I learned from my studies, these feelings are appropriate emotional responses to enduring historical injustices. To continue the incidents of atrocities, one woman was lying whose leg had been broken by a shell. A white soldier came up to her with a drawn saber. She raised her arm to protect herself when he struck, breaking her arm. She rolled over and raised her other arm when he struck, breaking it. Then he left without killing her. The soldier left her to suffer with excruciating pain until she died. It's hard to interpret these events in any other way than that these atrocities, these heinous acts, and these crimes against humanity were perpetrated by devils directly from the pits of the white Christians' hell. One more example. With the active encouragement of their officers, the soldiers not only scalped the dead, but performed an altogether astonishing array of other mutilations. including the severing of male genitalia to be turned into tobacco pouches. When the bloody 3rd Infantry returned to parade triumphantly down the streets of Denver, a short while later, the Coloradan citizenry turned out to cheer them as they rode by with scalps and other such trophies. Female genitals stretched over hats and saddle pommels, for example, plainly in view. I have to mention a genocidal massacre in California of the Yahiana people in the late 1860s. Supposedly, the Yahiana killed a steer belonging to a white man because they were hungry. So in retaliation for this crime, there was an attack by settlers upon the native peoples. In this event, all of the Yahiana people were killed. 33 Yahi were murdered and scalped at a cave north of Mill Creek, wherever that is in California, by 4 whites led by Norman Kingsley. Kingsley, as explained later, changed guns during the slaughter, exchanging his .56 caliber Spencer rifle for a .38 caliber Smith & Wesson revolver because the rifle, quote, tore them up so bad, particularly the babies, unquote. I am absolutely amazed by the compassion for the Yahiyani babies. Sarcasm. Ray, California. Vine Deloria writes, Ray, the gold fever in the 1860s and the miners embarked on a program of systematic genocide against the Indians of California, going so far as to have Sunday shoots of in which bands of whites would attack Indian villages, killing as many people as they could. Tribes were massacred to prevent them from holding their lands intact and out of reach of the gold-crazed miners. Final comments, getting to the end. Genocide of the indigenous peoples of what is now known as the United States of America is real. It began as early as 1492, when the first Western European arrived in indigenous homelands in the indigenous hemisphere, which hemisphere is now known as the Americas, the North, the Central, and the South Americas. It began with the slaughter of 8 million Native peoples in 21 years in the Caribbean. Dr. Martin Luther King, one of my heroes, more so than Washington, Jefferson, Lincoln, etc., said in regard to the beginning of the United States of America, he said, quote, our nation was born in genocide. We are perhaps the only nation which tried as a matter of national policy to wipe out its indigenous population. Moreover, we elevated that tragic experience into a noble crusade. Even today, we have not permitted ourselves to wipe out, to reject, and to wipe out its, we elevated that tragic experience into a noble crusade. Even today, we have not permitted ourselves to feel or reject remorse for this shameful episode. As David Stannard pointed out in his American Holocaust, just 21 years after Columbus's first landing in the Caribbean, the vastly populous island that the explorer had renamed Hispaniola was effectively desolate. Nearly 8 million people, those Columbus chose to call Indians, had been killed by violence, disease, and despair. And this violence continued on the mainland, and another 16 to 18 million First Nations peoples were murdered. And the US continues to wreak violence in the world in its quest for global dominance, implementing invasions, bombing, killing, stealing, occupying, and exploiting other peoples, especially those of color and their resources, for example, oil, in the 20th and 21st centuries. As Deloria writes, when one examines the history of US American society, one notices the great weakness in it. The country was founded in violence. It worships violence, and it will continue to live violently. Anyone who tries to meet violence with love is crushed, but violence used to meet violence also ends abruptly with meaningless destruction. Yes, violence is a US America's sweetheart. HBO put out a documentary or video called violence in American tradition. As the U.S. America continues to extend its power and control over weaker nations and to extend its empire, the indigenous peoples, not only of the United States, but also of the indigenous hemisphere, continues its struggle for physical and cultural survival and for recovery of pride and autonomy. That statement borrowed from Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz. We are still here, and we overcame genocide, the massive land theft, practically all of our indigenous homelands, broken treaties, suppression of our languages, the criminalization and suppression of our religious ceremonies and freedom, bounties on our scalps, concentration camps, residential boarding schools, and an assortment of crimes against humanity perpetrated against us, et cetera, and our struggle for freedom, human rights, land rights, water rights, hunting rights, and for dignity and respect will continue unabated. However, the above mentioned damning deeds have yet to be acknowledged and or admitted unless it's Native scholars teaching the courses, Native professors. They have yet to be taught in the schools, colleges, and universities, public and private. White scholars / academics who are both respected and are credible have to help us, the Native academics and writers and Native peoples. They have to start teaching the truth of what was done to the indigenous peoples who have known and experienced genocide and crimes against humanity since the white man arrived some 529 years ago. According to Dr. Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz, we have a, quote, settler society that has not come to terms with its past, whatever historical trauma was entailed in settling the land. And I thoroughly agree with the question she has raised for the future. How then can US society come to terms with its past? How can it acknowledge responsibility? Oh, Henana epectado. Yes, this is all I have to say. Wopida tanka oas achichiapido. I extend my deepest appreciation to all of you. How? That taku epeki hechetudo. Yes, what I have said is so. We are still here. We are still waiting. Mitakuya oasi, all my relatives. Thank you.
Itamaya Edo. Chris, thank you.
Oh,
So now we have the opportunity to ask questions. I would like to suggest that we begin with questions typed into the chat. See how we manage with that before we go to a more open format. We have a question here from Shelley. She writes, I am a white woman. I grieve over the history of genocide towards First Nations people. As we continue to raise awareness, what can we do right now, right here, to help heal?
Well, one thing is contact genocide scholars and contacting particularly Native genocide scholars. But we do have like David Stannard, a white man, he wrote the book American Holocaust. And another white man, his name was Richard Drinnen, he wrote a book called Facing West, Indian Hating and Empire Building. You can read those two, and you can read Ward Churchill, his book, A Little Matter of Genocide, or you can read Dr. Russell Thornton's book. But there's all, and you're welcome to contact me, and I can send to you by email names and their books, when it was published, etc. And that's one of the things you can do and start sharing it. And if you're not teachers or professors, but are parents, you can check with your teachers that are teaching your children What kind of books are they using? What do they teach about Columbus or George Washington or Abraham Lincoln or Thomas Jefferson or Theodore Roosevelt? What do they teach? Or Ronald Reagan or Donald Trump? What do they teach about them? And then get informed and be able to teach them. And hopefully in the future, some books will start coming out more often, and then eventually they'll make their way into the schools, public schools, colleges and universities, both public and private. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. Before we got started this evening, Chris, I overheard you saying something about something you were going to do in Mankato for Indigenous Peoples Day. Can you say something about what's going on?
Okay, this group is the Veterans for Peace. I'm, in case some of you didn't know, I am a veteran during the Vietnam era, and anyway, I'm a proud member of the Minneapolis chapter of the Veterans for Peace, but they are doing something. They like to ring their bells. So they're going to ring their bells in honor of the 38 Dakota patriots who were hanged there at Mankato, Minnesota. And their only crime was defending their homelands. Protecting their sacred sites and burial sites, defending their women, children, babies, elders, etc. And so that's what it's going to be about there, and that's going to be on Indigenous Peoples Day, which is Monday, October 11th.
Thank you,
Minnesota.
Thank you.
And I'm asked to make a few comments about that, so I will do so.
Great. So I see that one of us in the audience, John Stays, has raised his mechanical hand. Carla, can we unmute him, Mr. Stays, so that he can ask his question?
Oh.
Yes, sir.
Oh, there he is. Oh, no, that's you, Peter.
Oh, please, I think he's able to. Go ahead, John.
I think I'm back.
Yes, you are.
Yes. Well, to the question, what can we do? Well, we can pay back rent to Dakota Land Recovery, which is Makoche Ikikchupi in the Dakota language. We can return a part of profits from real estate sales to the same. And the web address is makocheikikchupi.com. I can put that in the chat so
please do.
People can look at Chris knows about this, and Chris's daughter is ahead of that and is on this too. So I'll put that in the chat. Thank you.
Thank you for adding those. I have a few things too to say about that, about what can be done. Like, some of our people started a project to rename Ramsey County because Ramsey was a genocidaire, a perpetrator of genocide. Most of the acts that were done in his administration, and according to my studies and teachings, being with the 7-8 years with the International Association of Genocide Scholars, those were genocidal acts. And so some of our people think that Ramsey County should be renamed. And of course, I also put in my 2 cents worth that I think it should be named Amnesia Ska. That's the ancient Dakota name for this area of where St. Paul is located, but it's translated as White Cliffs. So it would be, so what I'm suggesting is Ramsey County be renamed White Cliffs County. And there's precedent for that. Like my own county, Yellow Medicine County, comes from Pejihuta Zizik Apimakoche, land where they dig the yellow medicine, 35 miles down the river. Chashayapio Tue, the village where they paint the tree red. or Redwood County comes from the ancient Dakota name. Blue Earth County comes from the ancient Dakota name of Makato, which literally is blue earth. And of course, Mankato comes from that blue earth as well. And Isayanti is referring to a certain group and division of the Dakota Oyate, the Dakota people, and that's Isanti County or Candy-Ojai County, when the big fish come. I forgot, I think it's buffalo fish that come in the spring. And I don't know if that happens anymore, but anyway, it's called Candy-Ojai. We say Kandi-Ohi. So, but those are things too that can be done. And then to pay for the land here in Minnesota, the 54 million acres, we got paid a pittance. And then that pittance was paid a century later. I even got in on it in the mid 20th century. So that's the way the United States government operates. You can't trust the United States. You can't trust them to keep their word. And they violate over close to 500 treaties. They broke their word. And like as Vine Deloria Jr. says, the US it would take Russia another century to make and break as many treaties as the United States has broken. And the United States today invades countries, makes promises to the people, and then leaves. Korea, Vietnam, Afghanistan, or in Iraq, etc., etc. Okay, I'm sorry.
Thank you. Thank you, Chris. Are there other questions out there? Anyone want to ask a question? Or, Carla, why don't we stop the recording and go to gallery view and invite people to unveil themselves and unmute themselves. And if they'd like to have a little more informal, off the record chat, we can do a few minutes of that before we close for the evening. I have to say the stamina of this man who has lived 81 winters is impressive. Thank you, Chris.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah.